The Bombardment of Ellwood. It's an interesting story, and it's an interesting piece of history. Now, you might notice this video is going up on the Friday. That's because the video I'm probably putting up on the Saturday is probably going to be this week's comment response, because it's going to be an absolutely massive comment response. Because it's the comment response to what was last week's massive videos. Yes, last week's massive video, in terms of people commenting and the discussions that went on about it, was of course the Queen Elizabeth class, which received 82 comments, making it one of the most commented on videos ever in terms of its long patrol, and its live also received a further 36 comments, giving it a total of 118, I think, if my maths is not incorrect, comments. And so I'm letting that wait till Friday afternoon to record, because I'm going to see if there's any more comments that come in, and I'm going to tell people in the live this evening, which is about the Bombardment of Ellwood, that I'm going to be recording the comment response tomorrow. So if they've got any more comments to add, please add them now, and I will get back to them on Saturday with the comment response video. So I'm just doing that this week. I've been twisting a lot of videos around this week, but I've been having a fun time. A fun time. Anyway, the Bombardment of Ellwood. Now, of course, I start all my videos off with shameless book plug at the moment. I'm shameless. I don't know. It's always fun. There are lots of interesting scenarios going on in academia at the moment. I keep seeing videos on YouTube about the joy that is academia and academic life. And at a certain point you just go, I'm gonna do me, and if that happens, it's great. If it doesn't happen, then life goes on. So, for starters, the Bombardment of Ellwood. This is one of those things that often comes up. Was it a purposefully aimed for naval attack? Well, prior to it, there had already been Japanese submarines patrolling the American west coast. They had managed to sink some merchant ships, damaged a lot more than they sank. 2 probably are what they sank. Had some skirmishes with the US Navy, and then by the end of the month, that is by the end of December, they had returned to friendly waters for resupply. Those that went to Kwajalein, you know, that pretty usefully located atoll in the Marshall Islands, then returned to American waters for another deployment. And this is something which, if the Japanese had put a lot more effort into, could have been a serious hamper to the American war effort. But let's be honest, covering the entire American coast with 7 submarines is kind of pathetic in terms of the area of actual coverage. They're going to create a fear factor wholly massive compared to what they are actually there, and they can create complications, but in terms of actual impact, this is no Battle of the Atlantic scenario. Certainly, it's not the scenario which was going on in the Mediterranean and would go on when the Americans turned their submarines loose on the Japanese. In both those circumstances, there is a lot more destruction going on. Now, the Japanese government had learned that Roosevelt was due to give a radio speech on the 23rd of February 1942. This was going to be an important speech. This was going to be, stalling the American war effort, telling them how they were going to win, all those things. And the Japanese decide they're going to do a little bit of a psyops operation. They decided there were no balloons handy at the time, although they would start sending balloons later in the war. And that was a perfectly legitimate strategic attack methodology, considering what they had available resource-wise at the time. But at this point, they have a long-range submarine. They have it on the coast. And so they order the I-17 to go and shell the Californian coast on that day. Now, that, by the way, is not I-17. That is I-15, standing in for I-17, because finding a decent photo of I-17 proved impossible. And that is what she shelled the coast with. A 14cm, i.e. 140mm, 40 cal gun. Not exactly the most massive of weapons. A 5.5-inch, broadly speaking, you might call it, or, well, yeah, broadly speaking, 5.5 inches. Now, there are various stories about this. One of the most popular, and one of the most interesting, which if you actually go to Ellwood you would have possibly heard a few times, was that the attack had been, that the commander of the submarine, Commander Kozo Nishina, had been a naval reserve officer before the war, and had commanded a pre-war merchant ship and had a whole accident with a cactus when he stopped at the Ellwood oil field. However, unsurprisingly, by anyone who's ever studied naval history or ever worked with navies, that's not true, because, well, for some reason it's very rare that officers who go off to leave the naval service and become reservist officers then get called back to command submarines. It's not usually the way it's done. Sorry, a magpie's appeared. Where's your wife? Where's your wife? Thank you. We're just peering in the window at me. I'm going, I'm not superstitious, but do you know I'm not superstitious? So, that wasn't the case. Nishino was very much a career Japanese naval officer, a very experienced one, a very experienced submariner. He'd basically graduated and gone into submarines and been serving in submarines his entire career. Which is one of the reasons why he turns out to, during World War II, be one of the best Japanese submarine commanders, certainly one of the most successful, and also probably why he's got this mission, because, let's be honest, you would trust your expert submariner with this mission. Basically, at 7 PM on February the 23rd, 1942, I-17 came to a stop opposite the Ellwood field on the Gavetoa coast. It's a good job she came to a stop, because let's be honest, submarines are not exactly the world's best gun platforms. They're kind of low to the water, they're kind of not always the most stable, and you have none of the advanced fire control systems that a surface ship would actually provide you with. So, yeah. They opened fire 15 minutes later. So 15 minutes is how long it took to set up the gun and get it laid and be happy from a relatively stationary submarine against a relatively completely stationary land target. Well, as stationary as the Earth's rotation allows. Yes, this is not a channel for flat earthers. The Earth is round and it rotates. When it stops rotating, that's when we have trouble. Well, let's see. The first rounds landed near a storage facility. There was only a skeleton crew on duty at this point. They heard the rounds hit, and they thought the rounds were an internal explosion, i.e. something had gone wrong within their plant. until someone spotted the I-17 off the coast. A gentleman named G. Brown later told reporters the Emery submarine looked so big to him he thought it must be a cruiser or destroyer until he realised that only one gun was firing. There is part of me which is not surprised due to the general lack of information. I have been standing next to people who have pointed to OPVs and called them battleships. But the fact that he was confident enough in saying that to reporters was what worries me. They soon transferred their aim to the second storage tank. Brown and others called the police. I'm not sure what the police were going to do about it, but presumably they would call someone else. Because whilst the US police do tend to be armed, I don't think they have yet found the police force which has an anti-submarine warfare capability or artillery weapons. If you do know of a police force which has its own artillery guns and anti-submarine warfare capability, please send me a note. That is a police force I would like to have a discussion with, because I'd like to find out what they're using them for. Now, unsurprisingly, considering the scenario, the targeting was absolutely terrible, and rounds went all over the place. One round passed over Wheeler's Inn, the owner of which, Lawrence Wheeler, called the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office. A deputy sheriff then assured him that warplanes were already on their way, but none arrived. And again, how does the deputy sheriff know this? Is the deputy sheriff just saying something to reassure you? Where are the warplanes coming from? Who is deploying them? It's a night attack. The Japanese shells actually managed to destroy a derrick and a pump house. The pier and the catwalk suffered minor damage. And after 20 minutes, the gunners ceased fire. Probably because they realised they weren't going to actually hit anything else, no matter how hard they tried, because light had descended at that point, that low. If you consider we're now talking 7:50 from they started firing at 7 p.m. in the evening. Well, they came to a stop at 7 p.m. in the evening. They started firing by about 7:15. They stopped firing by about 7:35. And they fired between 15 and 25 rounds. No one's quite sure. Honestly, that's not really the highest rate of fire, but there again, that's about what you'd expect from a submarine crew on the deck of a submarine. Unfortunately, you have some issues with this. Okay? This is the first naval bombardment of the United States, purposeful naval bombardment of the United States by a foreign power since the War of 1812, officially. Unofficially, of course, there's the incidental shelling of, as often described, the incidental or accidental, or, well, we just happened to be aiming at something and we accidentally hit Orleans, the coastline of Orleans, Massachusetts in 1918. It's always nice when you accidentally hit the coast. It might be a war with America, but I'm not planning on actually attacking your coast. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to shoot there. I was aiming for your ships at sea, and it just went and hit you. This is not a purposeful bombardment. So it's, since the War of 1812. I'm fairly sure the classification by a foreign power, though, always interests me in that one, because it's kind of a nice way of skipping past the fact there's the whole American Civil War, where there's a lot of bombardment of the American coast by the Americans. Yeah, but that's the nature of a civil war. The thing is, this is an entirely ineffectual military operation. I mean, it does less than nothing to a very small part of the American oil industry. It's a blip. In the sheer totals that are produced by America, it is a blip. If you've ever played anything like Railroad Tycoon, that gives you an idea of it. But if you've actually ever studied an oil map or the oil development of the United States, this was an attack which was going to get no impact. However, by attacking where they did, when they did, they achieved a significant psychological impact. And here is the really sad thing, because in this attack on the United States oil refinery in Ellwood, California, no one dies. And this, remember, is on the 23rd of February 1942. The next night, because a Reverend Arthur Barsham of Montecito had told the police that he'd seen the I-17 turn southwards towards Los Angeles, apparently flashing signals to someone on shore, and in fact it was heading home, and the general fear the Americans seemed to have of an invasion, and we'll get into the reasoning behind their general invasion fears, this happens. The Battle of Los Angeles, and I'm not talking about some cool movie, I'm talking about the reality of it. Sometimes also known as the Great Los Angeles Air Raid. Pretty much becomes very clear very quickly that there had been no foreign forces involved. In fact, the United States Coast Artillery Association identified a meteorological balloon, which had been sent aloft at 1 AM, as having started all the shooting, and concluded that once the firing started, imagination created all kinds of targets in the sky and everyone joined in. US Air Force official history has attributed the event to war nerves. But the sad truth is that 5 died, 3 in car accidents and 2 of heart attacks. There are rumours that a Japanese aircraft carrier was cruising off the coast of San Francisco Bay Area, all sorts of things. Pearl Harbor has happened. The US Navy has been attacked in harbor, has been decimated, and the idea of the Japanese bogeyman coming is freshly upon them. The fact is that these events are what lead to the internment of the Japanese and Japanese American citizens. I would say that there is a lot of problems in World War II with knee-jerk reactions. We'll be getting into some of the knee-jerk reactions that happen, but this is one of the scenarios where you sit there and go, if you're not interning all the German American citizens when you're at war with them, or all the Italian American citizens when you're at war with them, why have you decided the Japanese Americans are any less loyal? There are probably some in them who are. There are probably some in the Italian American community who are, and some in the German American community who are. But they are, if they are there, they're going to be a very, very small minority compared to the vast majority. You'd hope, if you've done your things properly. But no, the Battle of Los Angeles, it is the full effect, really, of what this battle achieves. This little attack, 20 minutes shelling by a submarine, leads to this. And let's be honest, the internment of the Japanese Americans, that's even more of a detriment to the war effort in many ways. Because that's taking a whole chunk of population away from recruitment, away from utility in terms of war fighting. Well, not just in war fighting, but in terms of your factories and in terms of your other operations and your wider societal functioning, when you need to maximize efforts. Now, where does all this fear of invasions come from? Well, it comes from the British! Hello! Yes, this is why we have to talk about this, because we are responsible, in many ways, for the American fear of invasions. Because we actually did it to them. Yes. Yes, they did start the War of 1812. Yes, both sides had done things to each other which led to the War of 1812. The Americans think it's going to be an easy, quick win thanks to Napoleon. They very quickly learn that Napoleon is not a very good ally. Yes, they have some astounding frigate victories at sea. Yes, the moment actual large units of the Royal Navy are free and start to turn up, the Americans suddenly realise that sea is not a good place to be for them. And yes, once you have veteran soldiers, and you have to remember that if peace hadn't been declared when it was, the odds of Wellington and the rest of his army and a large number of troops coming across to America are quite high. The British are putting things in place, partially as an incentive to the Americans to, how do I put this, to agree to the peace, to get it done quickly, because the British can't really be bothered to fight the war. There's no real incentive. There is a small idea of rebuilding some of the 13 colonies. That's certainly being looked at. They do pursue that in certain areas. But, yeah. The British strategic war aims are pretty much for the War of 1812, stop the war in as advantageous position as possible, and dictate a favourable peace. We've already been through this once of trying to hold on to the North American colonies. We found the ones who want to stay British, we're happy with them, we'll leave the ones who don't want to be British to themselves. But, and I would say this is an interesting thing for those people who do then, go with the route of, oh, well, if Wellington and his army turns up, they win everything. No, because whilst the Americans might be the worst defenders of Washington known to mankind, in fact, honestly, yes, the British were bringing battle-hardened troops. Yes, the British had very experienced officers at every single level. Yes, the British troops were more than capable of what they were being asked to do. But the Americans did outnumber them, and were in defended positions, and you should be talking about 3-to-1 superiority in order to take a defended position, but, life happens. But when the Americans withdraw from Washington, they go to Baltimore, and Baltimore is somewhere they actually care about, and they defend it. And the Battle of Baltimore is, well, that's an American victory. And if we consider the Americans have roughly 16,000 militia there, about 10,000 regulars, and between Hampstead Hill, Fort McHenry, and some additional artillery they have there, they probably have somewhere in the region of 300 guns, 300 artillery pieces. And the British are turning up with 5,000 troops and 19 warships. But to be fair, at this point, so far, the Robert Ross, Alexander Cochrane and Arthur Brooke had so far managed to, without much effort, win against far larger American forces. But they found it a tough nut to crack, and the same happens at New Orleans. But we are the reason the White House is painted white. Apologies. But to be fair, your president, the American president at the time, had been preparing a celebratory victory feast in the White House when we started the battle. And the thing is, organising a victory feast before the battle's even been fought is a little bit putting the cart before the horse, and, well, just as with the Magpie earlier, whilst you might be confident of victory and believe that you are above the impacts of such things, and that really the single Magpie is not unlucky, there's no point in tempting fate. It's just a little bit of effort, a little bit of doing something, and you've just ameliorated fate. Never tempt fate. But and that is a legacy for the Americans. And then there's the American Civil War, where again, Union forces regularly make use of the sea to maneuver around. One of the things you have to remember in Britain is that there are huge invasion scares which happen on our history, but one of the reasons we can always justify having a small professional army and not having much in terms of a major reserve is that we actually haven't been invaded. Now, I know people like to go, well, since 1066. That's not quite true. There have been a few more recent ones than that. There have been some very interesting Jacobean events, and there, of course, was the Glorious Revolution. But in reality, it's been centuries. Okay, it's been centuries. It's not within anyone's living memory. That's the point. And then we go back and we look at the attack on Orleans from 1918. And the American reaction to that. Look at that. That's the shelling of U-boats. But the thing was, at this point, this can be called an incident. Because it's a one-off shelling by a U-boat that was trying to shoot at something else. Again, this is U-152 providing the photo for U-156 because I couldn't find a photo of U-156. As you notice, that has 2 deck guns. It helps with the shelling. And the attack on Orleans is very simple. Captain Lieutenant Richard Felt was probably, most likely, on orders to try and cut the transatlantic submarine communications cable which runs from Orleans to Brest in France. Felt, unable to really find the cable, becomes aware of the passing tugboat Perth Amboy, towing 3 barges, and the 3-masted schooner Lansford. Now, one of the interesting things is that traditionally people start to go, well, U-156 fired 2 torpedoes. Why would anyone who has such a limited supply of torpedoes as U-156 fire torpedoes at such slow-moving minor targets? I'm sorry. They carry 18 torpedoes. They have 2 20-inch bow torpedo tubes and 18 torpedoes total. They have 2 5.9-inch deck guns with 1,672 rounds for them, and 2 3.5-inch, that's 88mm, deck guns with 764 rounds between them. Why on earth would I fire one of my 1/9 of my entire torpedoes at a tugboat, but 3 barges and a schooner as warning shots, when I have all those gun rounds? I'm not going to. Now, we do know she chases them a bit. Fires using its 2 deck guns. Targets the tug and its tow. The Perth Amboy was heavily damaged. The schooner and the 3 barges were all sunk. At which point, 2 Curtiss HS-2L flying boats from Naval Air Station Chatham dropped bombs near U-156. But those bombs failed to explode due to, well, let's be honest, it was a Sunday, they were inexperienced, and there are probably things not done correctly. Don't worry, U-156 doesn't do any better against aircraft because it tries to elevate its guns to fire at the aircraft, but misses terribly. And it's those shells which land in the deserted marsh off Nassau Beach, meaning that Orleans is the only town in the United States to receive enemy fire during World War I. The thing is, they weren't deliberately aimed to go ashore. They were aimed to go at the aircraft, and it's just, life happens. No fatalities. The United States Coast Guard launched a surf boat under enemy shell fire and rowed out to rescue the 32 sailors. I'm not really sure if the nicest way if they were actually aiming for the rowboat, or if they would just happen to be firing at other things while the rowboat was actually wandering around. That would seem more likely to me, because they managed to rescue the 32 sailors aboard the tug and barges, and after firing 147 shells in the hour-long engagement, U-156 submerges about 11:30 a.m. and goes off to attack some of Allied ships. But of course, immediately newspapers start to declare there must be a submarine supply base in the Bay of Fundy. That's, of course, off between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia in Canada. That's where immediately the newspapers believe there must be a supply base. Because no submarine could make it across the Atlantic and do this. So, before we get on to the next one, I'm going to talk quickly about the Peter Ardell, because it was still alive. It's a 4-masted steel bark. Now, she had an interesting career. She was built in Maryport in June 1890. Named for Peter Ardell, who was a British person, but, he was actually from Liverpool, and that's where his business was headquartered, but this ship was built in Maryport for Ardell and Porter. She measured 2,075 net registered tons, 87 meters in length. Vessel was fashioned from steel plates on an iron frame. She had royal sails above double top and top gallant sails, and was the largest vessel built by Ritson. Originally captained by Captain G.A. Brown, and captained later by Captain H. Lawrence. Now, one of the interesting things that happens to her is that in 1906 she runs ashore on the Oregon coast en route to the Columbia River. And the reason she does this, well, we're not really sure. The crew altered course when they saw the Tillamook Rock Lighthouse at 3:20 a.m. on the 25th of October. And, well, 26th of October. And in the thick mist and rising tide, with strong winds coming out of the west, an attempt was made to wear the ship away from shore, but heavy northwest squall grounded her on the Clastop stands. There was little damage done to the hull, and plans were made to tow the ship back to sea, but after several weeks waiting for favourable weather and ocean conditions, the ship had listed to port and become embedded in the sands. Salvage rights were finally sold in 1917, but the wreck was never actually broken up. And parts of it still remain to this day. In fact, Captain Lawrence's, her last commander's, final toast to the ship was, "May God bless you and may your bones bleach in the sands." So, as you can see, this all gets disturbed on the 21st of June 1942, and that ends up actually with the Iredale's wreck being covered in barbed wire because of the potential invasion by the Japanese. Now, I should point out again that I did this slide, one of the ones I did at actually the beginning, and I forgot to mention that actually that's the I-26, not the I-25. The picture. Because again, we cannot find a picture of the actual submarine involved in this operation. Why do not many people take more photos of their submarines? Okay, I just want you to take a decent collection of photos of your submarines. You don't have to use them at the current time. I just want to have an accurate photo of your submarine for me to use. If someone who is a time traveler happens to go back in time and is talking to any of the navies in the 1920s and 30s, please tell them to start a program of taking photos of their submarines and their destroyers. Submarines and destroyers, I would like more photos, please. And patrol boats. Surely it can't be impossible to aim that every time you commission a new vessel, no matter what it is, you take its photo. Please. For me. I'm begging you. Anyway. So. The I-25, under the command of Akiji Tagami, was assigned to sink enemy shipping and attack the enemy on land with its 14cm deck gun. It sent off to the Oregon side of the Columbia River. It's another attempt to put ships on the American coast. Now, the I-25 entered US coastal waters following fishing boats to avoid the minefields in the area, and was also transporting a Yokosuka E-14Y seaplane for its own reconnaissance capabilities. His target was Fort Stevens. Fort Stevens dated from the American Civil War and was armed with Endicott-era artillery, which included 12-inch mortars and 10-inch and 6-inch disappearing guns. Always nice to have them. They fire, then they bop down, and then they pop up to fire. You load them, and then they fire again. Now, Tagami surfaces and orders his crew to open fire on Fort Stevens Battery Russell. The shots were unsurprisingly harmless. Some people think it's surprising that they didn't cause any difficulty. But when you look at Fort Russell, or when you look at Battery Russell, and you consider how well made it is, and what it was designed to stand up to, you start to go, and then you realise that again, they are firing from a submarine, so they are not the most accurate shots in the world, and that the fort's commander ordered an immediate blackout, refusing to permit his men to return fire, as that would reveal their position. And also having realised using his depression precision fighter, that the submarine was probably out of range of his guns, it makes sense, and it makes sense that the Japanese aren't able to hit him. In fact, most Japanese rounds land in either a swamp or a nearby baseball field. Please note this. They are getting rounds down on the baseball diamond or in a swamp, not actually hitting anywhere really near Fort Russell. Well, Battery Russell in Fort Stevens. I keep wanting to call it Fort Russell. I think I was reading about a Fort Russell the other week. I've got to remember where that was. Anyway. One round damaged some telephone cables, which was the only real damage that this whole bombardment caused. A total of 17 shells were fired at the fort. The US Army Air Force, then planes on a training mission, spotted the I-25, called her location out, and an A-29 Hudson bomber went to attack. The bomber found the target, but the I-25 managed to dodge the falling bombs and submerge. It's again a far bigger impact on the psychology than it is in actual reality of operational damage. The most damage done is probably to the Ardell when it gets wrapped in barbed wire, which is why I put what I did about it in here. It's just, yeah. And you can see why the psychological damage has the impact of the time. But the thing about this all is the whole recurring lesson of this whole subject, and the whole discussion of the whole subject, is that beware of the psychological impact of events. They will have an impact on everyone, even people who are prepared for them. And the lesson of history is, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So that's the reasoning behind the invasion. The scares of World War II, all these things, the Japanese have fed into it by attacking with submarines. Newspapers have blown it up to epic proportions. Everyone's going around in a nightmare fugue thanks to the Japanese' apparent astounding victories in Southeast Asia, when in fact you can actually pretty much provide a logical reason for all their victories and all their successes. And the fact that they prepared more than anyone else by the point it starts to happen in 1941, beginning of 1942, whereas others had reached their peak of preparations in terms of being capable available for it in 1939. Some were still working up, and some had degraded since 1939. Quite a lot of them, in fact, the British and the French had massively gone downhill in their preparations since 1939, as they had their forces suckered to the European theatre, because that was where the active war was going on. I know some people like to think that even with an active war going on, the British and the French shouldn't have restructured their forces in the Far East, but it's kind of difficult to turn around to your commanders and go, you know what, those brand new cruisers and submarines we've got out in the Far East region, no, we're not going to use those to fight a war, no. We're leaving them out as deterrent in Japan, deterrent against Japan, which at the moment we aren't fighting a war with. Sounds so much more defensible in your head, doesn't it, as a logical thought, than when you have to say it out loud and tell people who are fighting and who are the people in their command risking their lives and dying that I will not give you the newest and best equipment which I have available, which I had out there, in case of a war with Japan, because that looks more likely, because there is still a risk of war with Japan when you're actually fighting a war. It's so much easier to say. And it's a similar logic you have going on here. Because the trouble is, you might well know that realistically, a Japanese invasion of mainland America would require such a confluence of events and such a dramatic change to the timeline that you would have to pretty much go back to 1890 and start off not only a massive Japanese public health campaign to reduce infant mortality rate and reduce deaths through births and reduce illness rate by sort of massive reforms of sewage systems and public health care. Everything you can do, and nutrition, to maximize population growth. Everything you can do, so that you end up with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, more soldiers by the time you're fighting a war in 1940s. So that you have enough personnel. You would then also have to produce the infrastructure to build the ships necessary to get your forces across the Pacific. Because there are going to be a lot of Americans there. A lot of them. So, that brings us to the time when actually there was a real invasion. And we almost had a little fluffy invasion, but he was being called in and was trying to get away from getting his fur brushed. So, the Aleutian Island campaign, the actual invasion of American territory, because they didn't invade Pearl Harbor, they didn't invade the Hawaiian Islands, they didn't invade the Philippines, which were an American protectorate, but when it comes to actual American territory that was invaded, it's the Aleutian Islands. A campaign which lasts from the 3rd of June 1942 to the 15th of August 1943. 1 year, 2 months, 1 week and 5 days, which shows you the sheer distances involved, the sheer scale of what you're dealing with, because when you consider the size of the Japanese forces involved and the size of the American forces involved and what goes on, it's all of a scale of difficulty because of the distance. Now, the two opposing real command authorities are Admiral Bushido Hosoga and Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid. I would like to say that this should have been, on paper, a complete one-way street, if you consider the size of forces able to reign at their command. But Hosoga was very good at his job. The thing was, that doesn't detract from Kinkaid. You see, people can get into this and they can come back and go, well, Kinkaid should have won this as a walkthrough, so that must mean that Hosoga is great and Kinkaid is terrible. But Kinkaid isn't bad. Kinkaid is very good. He's Hosoga's match. And he has more forces. He just has the tyranny of logistics and the tyranny of distance. These two tyrants keep restricting his ability to do things. It's like you can have all the wonderful plans. You can have for paper all the forces, but you can't actually do anything with them. And you start to realize quite quickly, when you're looking at the Aleutian Island campaigns, that another power keeps turning up as well, and there's a third nation involved, Canada. And some of the Canadian troops deployed, yeah, they're not necessarily always the most numerous forces, but they are some very capable cold weather commando units, because the Americans have the 10th Mountain Division, which are their cold weather fighting force. They're a steeped in history division. But they don't have as many as... they don't have enough of them, as many as they need. So they do look at their Canadian brethren to the north and go, hello, fellow Alliance member, member of the Anglosphere, member of the world who speaks English. Hello! Do you happen to have some cold weather troops we can borrow? You know, they work. They do very good work together. But no, Kincaid and Asiga are very, very skilled matches. In technical rank, I've called them both admirals. But technically, he is a vice admiral. And at the time, in terms of when he's fighting this battle and when he's running this, he is, I think, also a vice admiral, or Mosford. He'd already fought in the Coral Sea, Solomon Islands campaign, and yeah, he's a successful and experienced officer. Please note, his reward for the successful completion of the Aleutian Islands campaigns is to go and be sent as the admiral to command the 7th Fleet and look after General Douglas MacArthur. So you can honestly say no one has suffered more for running a victorious military campaign than Kincaid. Kincaid would again at that point have 2 masters in this operation in Illusions. He had the tyrannies of distance and logistics, and in 7th Fleet he had King versus MacArthur. He had a fair number of officers who were difficult to him in both areas. In the case of Hosogaia, he is a career naval officer. He had served as executive officer and then captain of the heavy cruiser Chokai. He'd been executive officer on the battleship Higa and was commander of the battleship Mutsu. He made rear admiral by November 1935. He was commandant of both the communications and torpedo schools during 1935 and 1936, so very experienced in those areas. Promoted to vice admiral in November 1939. He's commander-in-chief of the Ryugyuan Guard District. In November 1940, he's given command of the 1st China Expeditionary Fleet. And in July 1941, he became commander-in-chief of the 5th Fleet, which was the administrative command based at Ominato, in command of Northern Pacific Forces. As part of the Battle of Midway, he is directed the Battle of Aleutian Islands, and the invasions that take place. However, he doesn't necessarily have the most great history, because he himself does have an interesting scenario. When his force, consisting of 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, is intercepted near the Komandorski Islands by the USN, led by Rear Admiral Charles Morris, a force comprising of 1 heavy cruiser, 1 light cruiser and 4 destroyers. The Battle of Komandorski Islands, Hisuga mistook shell splashes from coloured dye shells for bomb splashes and concluded he was under aerial attack. Seeking to protect his ships, he breaks off action and retreats from the battle, even though he'd severely damaged the USS Salt Lake City. This is what costs him command, and he's relieved by Shirakawazi, and then assigned to reserves. He's finally, for the rest of the war, he serves in Truk, serving as governor of the South Seas Mandate. It's an interesting scenario because, frankly, for both these commanders, let's be honest, I think they would have both fought over the assignment to Truk if the other choice was to go and work for MacArthur. But leaving that to one side, both of them has various accusations levelled them in their command. Soga is withdrawn because of this idea of cowardice, when in fact it was probably the most sensible thing. If you were under aerial attack, and if you really were under aerial attack, then you were facing that cruiser and destroyers you were facing were the tip of a far larger force of which he could not fight, and which he would have lost his fleet to. And 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 4 destroyers in 1943 are quite a major Japanese force, if we consider what they have available. If he loses those 8 ships, that's a loss to Japan. Thank God the Japanese didn't have more commanders like him. They might have actually retained their fighting ability longer. Anyway, the Battle of Dutch Harbour. This starts at the beginning of the campaign, and well, it's an air raid, and it's often considered a Japanese victory because, well, what happens is on the 3rd of June 1942, the Japanese carrier strike force under the command of Rear Admiral Kakuta, comprising the Ryoja and Junya, 2 smallish carriers, plus escort ships, got to within 180 miles of Dutch Harbour, and launch airstrikes at the US Army and USN facility. There. The idea was to neutralise this, which would be the likely first point of response for any invasion of the other islands. Shortly before dawn, at 02:58, the aircraft were launched. The strike is made up of 12 A6M0 fighters, 10 Kate, that's B5N, bombers, and 12 D3A Val dive bombers. The planes arrived over the harbour at 04:07 hours, attacked the town's radio station, oil storage tanks, caused some damage. And the gun crews from the various air defence batteries quickly realised the danger, without direction, run to their guns stationed around the harbour and began to return fire. In true belief that it's volume of fire that matters rather than likelihood of hitting their target, riflemen also started firing. One member of the garrison claimed to have hurled a wrench at a low-flying enemy plane. The highest casualties on this first day occurred when bombs struck Barracks 864 and 866 in Fort Mears, killing 17 members of the 37th Infantry and 8 from the 151st Engineers. When all the Japanese planes were recovered, they reported enemy ships in the vicinity. Search planes, however, found no ships within the area. But 4 of the E8N-2, Nakajima E8N-2 Dave reconnaissance planes, launched from Takao and Maya, encountered US fighters searching for the departing Japanese squadron. The 206th spent much of the night of the June 3rd moving guns off the mountain tops surrounding the harbour into the city of Unalaska and into the harbour facilities themselves to provide extra defence for what they thought was coming. Because they felt a land invasion was coming. Civilian contractors were put to work filling sandbags to protect the new gun positions, and on June the 4th, the Japanese carriers managed to be less than 100 miles south of Dutch Harbour to launch a second attack. At 1600 hours, the second airstrike of 9 Zeros, 11 Vals, 6 Kates took off and attacked the US facilities at Dutch Harbour again, this time arriving by 1700 hours. More targets were damaged at this point, including grounded American aircraft, an army barracks, ore storage tanks, aircraft hangar, and a few merchant ships in port. The Zero fighters concentrated on strafing the gun positions. Their bombers destroyed their bombers destroyed the fuel tanks located at the harbour, and one wing of the military hospital at the base was also destroyed. After hitting the fuel tanks, the dive bombers and high-level bombers then concentrated on the Phillimore and the Gillis, which they were sort of, to an extent, driven away from by the intense anti-aircraft fire, but they did destroy the station ship Northwestern, which, because of its size, they believed they destroyed a warship. It was actually a transport ship, which had been beached and used as a barracks for civilian workers. Even better, the firefighters managed to save its hull. Its power plant was thereafter used to produce steam and electricity for the shore installations, and an anti-aircraft gun was actually blown up by a bomb and 4 of the US Navy servicemen were killed. 2 Japanese dive bombers, 1 fighter were damaged by anti-aircraft fire, failed to return to their carriers, and Japanese planes also encountered an air patrol of 6 Curtiss P-40s over Otter Point. During the aerial battle which ensued, 1 Japanese fighter and 2 more dive bombers were lost. 2 of the 6 US fighters were also lost as well. Total losses for the Battle of Dutch Harbour for the Americans: 4 B-17s, 2 Martin B-26 Marauders, 2 P-40s, and 6 PBY Catalinas destroyed. 43 Americans were killed, 33 soldiers, 8 sailors, a marine and a civilian. Another 50 were wounded in the attack. None of the Japanese ships were harmed. 1 A6M-20 was damaged by ground fire and crash-landed on Akutan Island. Pilot was killed. The plane wasn't seriously damaged though, and that was recovered by American forces, inspected and repaired. This gave the technical intelligence for the US as it allowed them to develop a full understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of the Zero's design. So the Akutan Zero is a critical aircraft, and following day, Admiral Kakuta receives orders to break off further attacks and head for the Central Pacific to support the combined fleet, which was retreating after the Battle of Midway. And this is when the Japanese invasion forces start to turn up at Attu and Kisa. The invasion of Kisa is interesting, okay? Pretty much, the Fleet Command planned to occupy the Attu and Kisa Islands under AL operation, or Aleutian operation, were generated by the necessities of Fifth Fleet to try and secure its position, because it's a vast area of ocean and it has nowhere to readily support things. The Doolittle raids on Japan from the North Pacific Ocean on April 18th, 1942 had basically made this operation a necessity. After those attacks, the Army also acknowledged the need to set up patrol bases on the Western Aleutian Islands, and so they agreed to dispatch troops. Basically, the idea was you'd set up aircraft and you'd set up troops, and they would be forward observation posts instead of relying on fishing boats and the sheer distance to protect you. The actual landing force is kind of interesting because they have 500 from the naval landing forces, and that do the initial occupation, and then between roughly 5,000 civilians and soldiers are sent for the occupation to set up in the islands. The actual force the Americans have there when it's invaded is a 10-man weather station, between 1 and 6 dogs, a Lieutenant Moles who wasn't present during the initial landing, and 3 aircraft. The casualties and losses: 2 killed on the American side, 7 captured, 1 escaped later surrendered because, frankly, there's not much place for them to go on Kiska Island. There isn't. The weather station were USN. Theoretically, it was supposed to be 2 personnel. No, 12 personnel, but 2 were missing, and included a dog named Explosion. They realised at a certain point that Chief Petty Officer William C. House had escaped. That's when the search is launched by the occupying forces. House only surrendered some 50 days later because he was unable to cope with the freezing conditions and starvation going on anymore. He'd spent 50 days eating only plants and worms and weighed just 80 pounds. Prisoners of war, the rest of his unit had already been dispatched to Japan by that point. If you consider that the Americans, and I've pointed out the tyranny of logistics that's going to affect them in this scenario, the construction of the Alaskan Highway had only been approved and authorized by Congress and Roosevelt on the 11th of February 1942. It had started work, sort of it being approved on the 6th of February, but it's a 5-day process going through. 11th of February 1942 is when it sort of started off. So, if we consider what are the odds that this highway has been built by this time? No chance. It's mere months. So, this is, and of course the highway would never reach the islands. Never reach this far out, but the thing is, this means your logistics to get everything, you have to go from that much further back. You're not really bringing logistics from Alaska. You're bringing logistics from the west coast of the United States, continental proper. Mostly from the Seattle area. And you have to bring it up to coastal Alaska, and you have to make sure it gets the way you need to. Then you have to store it, organize it, because often it's shifted in merchant ships, then shift it, reorganize it, then get into position, and then start sending it out to where you need it, and forming it up into military packages. And then you realize that's quite a long way itself, again, from where the islands are. The occupation of Attu, well, that's a slightly different scenario. A force consisting of 1,140 infantry under command of Major Matsutoshi Hashimo took control of the island and captured Attu's total population. which consisted of 45 Aleuts and 2 white Americans. Charles Foster Jones, an amateur radio operator and weather reporter from St. Paris, Ohio, and his wife Etta. Charles was killed by the Japanese forces immediately after the invasion due to his refusal to fix the radio he previously destroyed to prevent the occupying forces troops from using it. His wife was taken to Bund Hotel in Yokohama, Japan, which was where also the Australian rebel New Britain New Nurses had been taken prisoner after capture of Rabaul. And they were later transferred, of course, to the Yokohama Yacht Club and kept there from 1942 to July 1944, when they moved to the old Totsuka Hospital, also in Yokohama. And, well, they were there till August 1945. She didn't die till 1965 at the age of 86 in Bradenton, Florida. The nearest American forces were Unalaska Island in Dutch Harbor, and at the airbase on Adak Island. American air and naval forces bombarded the island, but whilst the Japanese intended to hold the Aleutians only until winter 1942, originally the occupation continued in 1943 in order to deny the islands to the Americans. One of the really interesting things is that in August 1942, the garrison of Attu is moved to Kiska to help repel a suspected American attack. And so from August to October 1942, Attu itself is unoccupied. There was no one there. The Americans still regard it as the Japanese occupied, but there's no one actually there. Until a 2,900 force, personnel force, under Colonel Yasumo Yamasaki arrives. They constructed the airfield and fortifications until the 11th of May 1943, when 15,000 troops of the American troops landed. Think about that. The Americans have to turn up with 15,000 troops in May 1943. When, honestly, in between August and October 1942, so September 1942, they could have probably turned up with one man and a dog and taken the island. They couldn't have held it with one man and a dog, but they could have turned up and taken it back. And the reason I'm adding in the dog is because the person needs company if they're going to be on an island that big on their own. Shoulda, woulda, coulda. If you'd known, if you'd been able to. You have to have the knowledge. The Americans break a lot of Japanese codes, but they didn't realize that was happening, because otherwise they would have done something. It would have been a logistic stretch, because they were preparing for major operations to pull these things back. But they would have done something, because only a fool wouldn't. It might have been a case of load up a flotilla of destroyers with as many Marines as you can grab and many troops as you can grab and get them out there and tell them to dig in. As much food and ammunition as you can take and go and dig in. And then we'll do the rest later. Get some CBs in there with them, if you can, and some equipment, and have them build an airfield and then start flying in stuff. You might not realise, might not be sure what you're flying in, but fly in what you can. There are options you could have done if you'd known about it. But the thing is, by the time they realise and have the information the Japanese are there. And a garrison of 2,900 troops dug in takes a lot more force to deal with it than none would have taken, than zero would have taken. And again, if the Japanese turn up with 2,900 troops, they're going to require a lot more troops than what garrison you've got out there. So if you'd had a few hundred, that would have prevented the 2,900 troops landing. The Attu village was abandoned after the war, and to be honest, for various reasons. I would say some sort of legitimate in terms of saying we can't protect you, but some which are grievous. Do not let the Aleuts go back. They are basically going, well, no, we can't protect you, you're too small population, this. And yeah, you can see where they're coming from to an extent, distance, etc., but also, if that had been, you do wonder if that there wasn't a healthy dose of, we just don't want to pay the money for you. If you were a different population, we might have paid the money. And if we'd thought more about the whole strategic value of the scenario and having populations on these islands, and how that gives us a far stronger claim to certain things in this area, they might have been sensible in thinking that through and actually building a garrison there. Out of this, you do have Operation Cottage, which is the tactical maneuver and landings to take back Kisa and for the rest of the Aleutian Islands campaign. However, there's a small problem with Operation Cottage. It's all done to deal with the Japanese. However, whilst they had suffered heavy casualties in Attu Island in its recapture, and planners were therefore expecting another heavy operation, the Japanese hadn't been planning to defend it. They'd planned an evacuation. In fact, starting late July, they're increasing signs of Japanese withdrawal. And on July the 28th, radio signals from Kiska ceased entirely. So, on August the 15th, 1943, the US 7th Infantry Division, the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment of the 10th Mountain Division, and the 13th Canadian Infantry Brigade from the 6th Canadian Infantry Division landed on opposite shores on Kiska. The Canadian regiments included the Canadian Fusiliers, City of London Regiment, the Winnipeg Grenadiers, the Rocky Mountain Rangers, and the St. John Fusiliers. It also involved the first combat deployment of the 1st Special Service Force, which was the elite American-Canadian Joint Commando Unit. The US and Canadian forces mistook each other for Japanese, and a Canadian soldier shot at US lines, believing they were Japanese, and many friendly fire incidents occurred, which left 28 Americans and 4 Canadians dead, and 50 wounded on either side. Progress was hampered by mines, time bombs, and ammunition detonations, vehicle accidents, and booby traps. Stray Japanese mine also caused the Abner Reed, destroyer of the Fletcher class, to lose a chunk of its stern. The blast killed 71 and 47 wounded. So, total are, you're probably looking at about 123 killed and 150-ish wounded. Japanese losses, I've not listed those. None, because there were no Japanese there by the time they arrived. The Japanese had withdrawn. Please note, it's not the only time that the Americans had an issue with assaulting an unoccupied island. Operation Chronicle, which was the Allied occupation of Woodlark Island in Kirana, territory of Papua, also turned up with roughly 16,800 troops and found no Japanese there. Because the Japanese were smart enough to realise they were overextended and withdrawing, and of course, It's one of those things. If you did turn up with no forces and it turned out the Japanese were covertly there, you'd have then been in a lot of trouble because your troops you'd sent in would have been killed. But if you turn up with all this force and then it turns out there's no one's there, you look like you've wasted a lot of effort. Because honestly, you sit there and go, well, actually, should you have just deployed a couple of battalions of combat engineers to go and clear the booby traps? And slowly, methodically work their way through the island, making sure they get all the booby traps. You can say that with hindsight. You can't say that with foresight, can you? Because you don't have foresight. But the Aleutian Islands and the campaign that resulted are the actual Japanese occupation of American territory in World War II. I hope you enjoyed it all. Thank you for watching. And the question for today is going to be, how would you do it? Okay, Kincaid has a problem, and I haven't talked much about strategic thinking because honestly, there's not much real revelations of strategic thinking. It's a very methodical, straightforward campaign, utilising its limited resources to the best ability you can do. You can't do fancy things when you're in that situation. You've got islands which are basically a straight line. You work your way down them from your resources forward and move your resources up with you. But what would you have done differently? Look at the forces they have available and think, what would you have done differently? I think I've got these slides from an old version of the standard. Oh well. So we have got Brew Ships 104 on Sunday, and Brew Ships 104 we will be announcing what will be the topics to be voted on in the Patreon vote for March, and hopefully also making some announcements for June. That should be fun. But thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. Oh good lord, this is an old one. I haven't underlined marine diesels. Where did I put this together?